he said. "I don't need someone who breaks easy," she said. "Then you've got the right woman." He stood in the barn doorway with a rope coiled over one shoulder and an expression that had nothing welcoming in it, and Audrey Moss, 28 years old, 2 days off the train from Kansas City, boots already dusty from the walk up the road where the wagon had left her, looked right back at him and did not flinch. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The Wyoming wind moved through the yard and lifted the ends of her traveling coat and settled again. Then Levi Cross turned and walked back into the barn, and Audrey picked up her bag and followed him, because where else was there to go? She had written to the agency in March. The same week her father's creditors came to clean out the shop. There was nothing dramatic about the decision. She had looked at what remained of her life in Kansas City, a rented room, a job at Langford's livestock auction house that paid enough to eat and not enough to stay, and she had made the kind of calculation she was good at. The numbers did not add up. They had not added up for some time. She needed something different, and she had learned early that waiting for something different to arrive on its own was a strategy for people with more time than she had. The letter from Levi Cross had come 6 weeks later. It was not a love letter. She had not expected one. 4 sentences, the name of the ranch, the county in Wyoming, the nature of the work, and a single line at the end that she had read 3 times before she set it down. "I need someone practical. Sentiment won't keep cattle alive." She had written back the same day. She had not told herself it would be easy. She had not told herself it would be love. She had told herself what she always told herself when the ground went uncertain, that she had been in worse situations and had found her way through them, and that was going to have to be enough. The Holloway Ranch sat in the foothills of the Wind River Range in a valley that caught the afternoon light and held it like something precious. It was beautiful country in the way that country can be beautiful and merciless at the same time. The grass was thin and yellowed in October, thinner than it should have been. She noticed that on the ride up. She noticed the way the creek bed ran shallow and rocky where it should have run full. She noticed the cattle she could see from the road, maybe 40 head, ribs more visible than they ought to be, moving slow. She filed all of it and said nothing. The house was large and solid and cold in the way of houses where the fires had been going out too often. Someone had cleaned it recently, swept and straightened, but underneath the effort there was the feel of a place that had not been fully inhabited in a while. A kitchen with good bones and empty shelves. A parlor with 2 armchairs positioned at angles that suggested they had not been moved in a long time. A hook by the back door where a woman's apron still hung, washed clean and folded careful over the hook. And beside it, so small she almost missed it, a pair of child's boots. Red leather, maybe a size 3. Audrey set her bag down in the middle of the kitchen and stood still for a long moment. Then she took off her coat, hung it over the back of a chair, and started a fire in the cook stove. She asked him that first evening how long the drought had been running. He looked up from his plate with something sharp in his expression, like she'd pressed on something he hadn't offered her. 3rd year, he said, going on 4th. She nodded and didn't ask more. But she had seen the creek. She had seen the cattle. She knew what 3 years of drought did to a grazing operation in country like this, and she knew the numbers that followed from it. And she knew those numbers were not good. He was not a man who talked easily. That was clear within the first day. He communicated in the way ranchers communicated, directly, briefly, in terms of tasks and conditions. There was a list for her on the kitchen table the second morning, written on the back of an envelope in handwriting that was blunt and small. Kitchen, garden, store accounts. Help Mick with the South Penn afternoons when needed. She read it, folded it, and put it in her pocket. He didn't ask how she intended to read the accounts. She thought he probably assumed she couldn't. She could. She had been reading livestock accounts since she was 16 years old, when her father had taken a job as a floor clerk at Langford's, and she had started doing the books in exchange for a desk and a lamp after closing. She knew what a healthy herd ledger looked like, and she knew what a desperate one looked like, and the Holloway Ranch ledger was somewhere in between. Not catastrophic, but leaning. Mick was the ranch hand, a short and careful man in his 60s who had worked the Holloway spread since before Levi's father died. He had the quality of a man who understood more than he said and had made peace with that arrangement. He welcomed her with a nod and went back to his work, and she respected him immediately for it. On the fourth day, she found him repairing a fence line on the east side and brought coffee without being asked, and they drank it side by side looking out at the dry creek bed. "How many head did he lose?" she asked. Mick looked at his cup. 63, he said, last winter and the spring before. She did the arithmetic without saying it out loud. He had started with something close to 120. He was running the ranch on barely a third of what it needed to carry itself. "The bank?" she asked. 6 months, Mick said. "Note comes due in April. The payments more than the cattle are going to bring at current prices. He knows it. I know it. Now you know it." She drank her coffee and looked at the dry creek and said, "Did he tell the agency that?" Mick was quiet for a moment. Then, he told them he needed someone practical. The thing that cracked the surface between them first was not a conversation. It was a fence post. She was walking the south boundary line on the 9th day, checking the wire the way she'd gotten into the habit of, after Mick showed her where the weak spots were when she saw it. One of the older posts, heavier than the rest, driven deep, carved into the wood on the side that faced the house, where someone standing at the kitchen window could just make it out if they knew to look. CLC, 1897, 3 initials and a year. She stood there with the autumn wind on her face and looked at it for a long time. She knew, the way you know things about a house when you live in it and pay attention, that Levi Cross had not always lived here alone. The apron on the hook, the child's red boots, the way he moved around the kitchen like he was leaving room for someone who wasn't there. She had known there was loss in his past. She had not asked, she still did not ask, but she put her hand on the fence post briefly, on the carved initials, and something quiet and careful moved through her. Something that looked, if she was being honest with herself, like understanding. She did not say anything to him that evening. She made supper and sat across from him the way she did every night. But she watched him differently now. She watched the way his eyes moved sometimes without landing, the way a man looks when he is seeing something that isn't in the room. She watched the way he had never once sat in the kitchen chair against the left wall, the one position closest to the window, as though someone else had claimed that spot long ago, and he had not seen fit to move it. She decided to ask him directly, not about the initials, that felt like his to hold until he chose otherwise, but about the other thing. She found him in the barn before sunrise, working alone with a calf that had come early and weak. She stood in the doorway until he looked up. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer me straight." He set down the water bucket. "All right. Why did you write to the agency? Not the practical reasons, I know those now, the bank, the note, the 6 months. But a man who needs help on a ranch hires a hand. You wrote for a wife. Why?" He was quiet for a long time. The calf made a small sound in the straw and he put a hand on its neck without looking at it. "Because Mick told me the bank would negotiate better with a married man," he said. "Stability, less risk in their eyes." He paused. "And because it had been 2 years and Mick said I'd stopped making plans that ran past next season. Said I was ranching like a man who didn't expect to be here long." The barn was very still. "Are you," she said, "expecting to be here long?" He looked at her. The early light came through the slats and she could see what 2 years of drought and alone had done to a face. Not broken. She had seen broken. This was something different. This was a man who had put his head down and kept going, because stopping was not in him, but who had forgotten somewhere along the way what he was going in the direction of. "Still deciding," he said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, his voice held something that wasn't flat, something uncertain and raw and real. "I thought bringing someone here would remind me." "Has it?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Getting there," he said. The ledger work took her 12 days, evenings after supper by lamplight, while he read or went over supply lists at the other end of the table. She didn't speak much during those evenings. Neither did he, but she was aware of him being there, and she thought he was aware of it too. The way the silence had changed from the first week to this one. No longer the silence of 2 strangers working around each other, but something quieter and less effortful, like a house where someone had finally gone ahead and lit all the lamps. On the 13th evening, she looked up from the ledger. "You have 47 head of Hereford Cross." He looked up. 46. "The calf in the east pen. He's going to make it. I've been watching him." A pause. "Hereford Cross in this condition. You're thinking they'll bring maybe $11–12 a head at fall prices. Drover's rates." That's what the market's running, he said. The Cheyenne premium buyers are running 18 to 20 for that specific cross right now, she said. I know because I spent 4 years at a livestock auction house pricing sales across 3 territories. Ranchers southeast of here are rebuilding herds after the 95 die-off, and the Hereford cross is exactly what they're paying up for. She met his eyes across the table. You're selling to the wrong buyer. At 18 ahead, your fall sale covers 60% of the April note. That changes the conversation you have with the bank. Levi was very still. The bank already has terms set. Terms can be renegotiated when you walk in with a better number than they expected, she said. I've watched that happen. I know what a bank does when the collateral turns out to be worth more than the loan officer wrote down. She slid the paper she'd been working on across the table. I've drafted the argument. He looked at it. He read slow a man reads when information matters to him, not passively, not politely. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. He set the paper down and looked at it for a long moment. You knew this when you arrived, he said. I suspected it when I saw the herd from the road, she said. I confirmed it from the ledger and what Mick told me about where you've been selling. You didn't say anything. I needed to understand the full picture first, she said, and I needed you to trust me enough to let me look at it. He was quiet. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed cold against the kitchen windows. Then, the buyer, you'd know how to find one. I'd know where to write, she said, and what to say. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, and she watched something move through him. Not relief exactly, because a man like him didn't arrive at relief quickly, but something adjacent to it. Something like the first loosening of a knot pulled tight for a very long time. Write to them, he said. Tomorrow. Tonight, she said, and pulled a fresh sheet toward her, and he watched her write without another word. The bank inspector came on a Thursday in November, a man from the Casper office, who had the careful politeness of someone doing an unpleasant job with professional courtesy. He walked the property with Levi and Mick, looked at the cattle, looked at the ledgers Audrey had organized, looked at the projected sale figures she'd drafted. He asked questions that had the shape of routine and the edge of assessment. At one point, he turned to her directly. Where did you develop this background, Mrs. Cross? Langford's Livestock in Kansas City, she said. 4 years pricing cattle sales across Wyoming, Colorado, and the territories. He looked at Levi. Something passed between them she chose not to analyze. The Cheyenne buyer, he said. You've received a response? Yesterday, she said, and laid the letter on the table. He read it. He folded it and set it down and was quiet for a moment. I'll need to take this back to the office, but the numbers here represent a material change from what was on record. If the sale confirms at this value, we'd be looking at a restructured payment schedule rather than the full acceleration. After he left, Levi stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked at the table. Then he looked at her. You planned for that, he said. I prepared for it, she said. There's a difference. One is hoping something happens, she said. The other is deciding what to do when it does. The line of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, not yet, he wasn't there yet, but the beginning of one. The possibility of one, which was more than she'd seen in 7 weeks. She turned back to the stove before he could see what that did to her. The snow came early that year, first week of December, 12 inches in 2 days, and it came on top of ground drier than it should have been. And by the second morning the low pens were flooding. What she had not expected was the neighbors. It was Mick who had ridden out in the first hour, to the Deering spread to the north, to the Whalen brothers south of the creek. And she found out later he had been doing that for years, quiet and steady, maintaining the connections Levi had let go of after the accident. When the Deering men rode in with shovels and the Whalen brothers came with extra hands and a wagon, Levi stopped in the middle of the yard and went very still. Audrey saw his face from the kitchen doorway. She saw the moment when the self-contained, alone for 2 years man understood that these were not people doing him a favor. These were neighbors who had been waiting for him to need them, who had needed him in turn at other times, who were here because that was what this country asked of people who intended to survive in it. He worked all day in the snow beside them, and she brought food out at noon and coffee in the afternoon, and the Deering wife arrived at 2 with bread and a strong opinion about drainage that turned out to be correct. By evening, the pens were clear and the cattle moved and the neighbors sat in her kitchen eating supper, and the house was louder and more alive than it had been in. Mick told her quietly, over the dishes, 2 years and 4 months. He told her on a night in December when the snow had settled, and the world outside was still and white, and the kitchen was warm from the fire she'd kept going since morning. She was mending a tear in his heavy work coat when he came in from the final barn check and sat down across from her at the table and did not go to bed the way he usually did. She looked up. He had something in his hand, a small thing. She recognized it after a moment, a tin button painted blue, the kind that comes off a child's coat. He was turning it between his fingers without looking at it. Her name was Celia, he said. His voice was level, the way a voice is level when a person has practiced saying a thing until the shape of it no longer breaks them, but the weight of it is still fully there. My wife, Celia Louise Cross. He paused. And my daughter was Rosie. She was 3 years old. She had blue buttons on her winter coat, and she was always losing them. Audrey set the coat down. She did not say anything. She let him have the room and the quiet. Wagon went over on the Lander Road in March of '97, he said. Ice on the descent. Early morning, I was at the ranch. He turned the button once more and closed it in his palm. I built that fence post the summer they came out here with me. Celia said she wanted to see something from the kitchen window that was mine, not just the mountains. So I drove the post and I put her initials where she'd see them. He looked at his closed fist. I was in the yard the first morning. I watched her find it through the glass. She put her hand flat on the window. Audrey's eyes burned. She did not let them. I don't know why I'm telling you this, he said. Not a deflection, a genuine uncertainty, as if he had surprised himself. Because it's been 2 years, she said carefully, and the only person who knows all of it is Mick. And Mick is not the kind of man you can say Rosie's name to without him having to go outside for a while. Something shifted in his face. She had 3 different laughs, he said quietly. A big one for when I fell off things, a small one for when she thought of something funny by herself, and a surprised one, just one sound like she couldn't believe she was that happy. He stopped, set his fist flat on the table. I keep thinking I'll forget them. I can't decide if that would be better or worse. You won't forget them, she said. You might stop hearing them every time you close your eyes, but you won't lose them. He looked at her directly, for the first time in the conversation. That sound like something you know, or something you're guessing? My mother died when I was 22, she said. I can still tell you exactly what she smelled like. The specific sound she made, when she laughed at something she wasn't supposed to find funny. She met his eyes. You don't lose them. They just become something you carry instead of something that carries you. He was very quiet. Rosie sounds like someone the world needed longer, she said. His jaw worked once. He opened his fist and looked at the blue button lying in his palm. Yeah, he said, she really was. Neither of them spoke again for a long while. The fire settled in the stove, and the night was enormous outside, and the kitchen was warm and close. She picked up the coat eventually and went back to her mending, and he stayed where he was, and the silence between them was the best kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Audrey, he said, just her name. The way he'd started saying it somewhere around the 5th week, without the formality, just the word, as if he'd quietly given himself permission to use it. I know, she said, before he could say whatever came next. Me too. He exhaled, slow and long. She kept her eyes on her work, and she was smiling at the coat in her lap, and she did not let him see that either. The Cheyenne buyer confirmed in January, $18.50 a head for 46 Hereford Cross, delivery in February. The sale cleared 68% of the April note. Levi went to the Casper Bank in February with Audrey's documentation and a written statement from the Deering family attesting to the ranch's standing, and he came back with a restructured payment schedule that ran 18 months instead of 4. He told her, across the supper table, plainly the way he told her everything now. She nodded and passed him the bread, and they ate and talked about the spring calving schedule. And neither of them mentioned that 6 weeks ago, neither of them had been certain there would be a spring calving schedule at all. It was April when the creek came back. Not all the way, drought doesn't resolve in one season, but enough. Enough to run clear over the stones where it had been going muddy and slow. Enough that she heard it from the kitchen garden where she was turning the soil for spring planting. And she stopped and just listened to it. and felt something settle in her that she had not known was unsettled. Levi found her there. He stood at the edge of the turned earth and watched her work for a moment before he said anything. "Water's up on the south branch," he said. "I heard it," she said. He was quiet. The April sun was on him, and his hat was in both his hands, and his expression was the one she had learned across 6 months to read accurately. The expression of a man for whom words were a serious undertaking, who chose them the way you choose the right tool for a specific job, deliberately and without waste. "I want to put your name on the deed," he said. "Not just the marriage record. The deed, the ranch," he held her gaze. "I want it to be yours the way it's mine, because it already is. And I want to say that in front of whoever needs to witness it, and mean it the way it's supposed to be meant." She sat back on her heels and looked at him for a moment. "We're already on the bank documents," she said. "Both names." "That's the bank's paper," he said. "I mean ours." She looked down at the soil in her hands, dark and damp from the irrigation she'd run that morning. Good soil. It had been good all along. It just needed someone to pay attention to it. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." He exhaled, slow and deep, and she could feel the size of what he'd been carrying without knowing it, only finding out now that he'd set it down. He put his hat back on and looked out at the ranch, the house with its smoke rising, the fence line running clean, the cattle on the south slope, the creek she could hear from where she knelt, and he looked at it the way a man looks at something he has decided to keep. Not desperately, not with the white-knuckled grip of someone afraid to lose. Just the settled, deliberate look of a person who has chosen. "The fence post," he said. She waited. "I'd like to add your initials, below hers." He looked back at her. "If that's all right with you." She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. Outside, the creek ran clear over its stones, and the April wind moved through the new grass, and the ranch was exactly what it had always had the bones to be, and exactly what it would be now, for both of them, for whatever came next. "It's all right with me," she said. She had come to Wyoming because the numbers in Kansas City hadn't added up, and she had found a man doing the same desperate arithmetic on a different set of books, and they had sat down together and worked through it the only way anyone ever works through the hard ones, honestly, without pretense, one line at a time. She had not expected love. She had not been wrong to find it. Once she stopped waiting for it to arrive, and started paying attention to what was already there. The way it accumulated. In supper tables and lamplight, and a tin button held in a closed fist, in the name of a little girl, with 3 different laughs and blue coat buttons she kept losing, in a fence post that faced the kitchen window, so that whoever stood there could always see it. You did not plan for this kind of thing. You showed up with what you had, and you did the work, and you stayed when staying was the harder choice, and eventually, not all at once, not dramatically, but the way a creek comes back after a long drought, gradually and then fully, it became yours. All of it, every last acre.